So I'm John Jacobson. I retired in 2024, but I'm still kicking. My colleague is Keith Klovers. He's counsel at Latham & Watkins. We're here to talk about our recent ALJ article on overlapping markets, where Keith did 90% of the work and all the good work. So Keith, up to you.
Thank you, John. And John, as you know, is very modest and too modest on this one. We are here to talk about overlapping markets, which is the latest effort to rebrand and resuscitate the submarkets principle. Overlapping markets are exactly what they sound like. I think of them kind of as Russian nesting doll markets. So you have a large market, you open it up, and there's another market inside of that. You open that one up, and there's another market inside of that. One of the examples that we'll go through today, which is near and dear to my heart, is the Pabst case from the 1960s, where they defined a market for beer sales in the state of Wisconsin, which is where I'm from originally, beer sales in the Midwest, including Wisconsin, and beer sales nationally, including in the Midwest and including in Wisconsin. So you get these overlaps then that build up as you assert more and more markets. We think that overlapping markets are problematic, and we will explain that in the course of the presentation, along with our proposed solution, which is called the one market per transaction rule. So the problem with overlapping markets is that they simply do not have a good foundation legally or economically. I think everybody has heard the citation of the brown shoe dictum, and we will talk about that today. But when you actually dig into what's there, there's not much. And there's quite a bit to the contrary. I'm going to advance the slides, and we're going to see. I may get this wrong because we jumped around a little bit. But I wanted to start with these two views of overlapping markets because they come from the same agency 8 years to the day apart. Until a few years ago, most everybody agreed with the first proposition there. Which comes from the DOJ's pretrial brief in the Electrolux case. Market definition is the first and often most consequential analysis that courts conduct in analyzing mergers. Frequently, the government alleges narrow markets, the defendants describe broad markets, and the court must choose between these competing approaches. Well, that's not the rule that the agencies prefer today. And so if you read the new merger guidelines that were issued 8 years to the day later, they now say multiple overlapping markets can be appropriately defined markets. They have an example involving a merger to monopoly for food that would lessen markets for food, baked goods, cookies, low-fat cookies, and premium low-fat chocolate chip cookies. 5 nested markets. And that illegality in any one of those, in any city, would be sufficient to prohibit the merger. And the fact that one area comprises a relevant market does not mean that a larger, smaller, or overlapping area could not as well. So we went from courts must choose, right? That's kind of the purpose of litigation. We dispute a point, and the court finds the facts, to one does not negate the existence of the other. I submit that makes no sense, right? That if Chips Ahoy and Mrs. Fields cookies were going to merge, the court would have to decide, are consumers going to be better off or worse off, right? Should I enjoin this merger? And under the guidelines approach, the answer is both yes and no at the same time, right? They would say, well, Chips Ahoy and Mrs. Fields cookies, they compete in a broader market for baked goods. We don't see any competitive harm there. They also compete in a market for premium low-fat chocolate chip cookies, and that's problematic. But it really can't be both, right? Either Oreos are an effective competitive constraint, and brownies and all manner of other things, or they're not. And what's even more problematic in the case of overlapping markets is that can be true even for the same transaction, right? That's the whole point of the overlap. And so, if I as a consumer go to the grocery store, if I go to Giant and buy a box of Chips Ahoy cookies, under the guidelines approach, that purchase is constrained, is competing in a market for only other low-fat or premium low-fat chocolate chip cookies, maybe there's 2 or 3 other products in that market, and simultaneously I'm apparently also considering everything up to all food in the store, right? And it's not both, right? I am making a choice, I have a competitive set that I am considering that constrains their ability to raise prices. So the problem then, I think, is kind of like the old F. Scott Fitzgerald quip. So he says the test of a first-rate intelligence is the ability to hold two opposing ideas in the mind at the same time and still retain the ability to function. I don't think antitrust is that smart. I'm not that smart. And I don't think antitrust functions well when we are asked to hold two opposing ideas in our mind at the same time. But thankfully, the guidelines approach is not the law today. John?
So thanks, Keith. So market definition is essential in everything except the per se case. Economists hate that. They revolted against it for years, and the courts have basically said, we don't care, market definition is required. And as Keith mentioned, the law had been for many years that the courts would have to choose between competing market definitions, typically narrow market urged by plaintiffs or agencies, and the broad markets tendered by defendants. So for example, in 1956, in the DuPont cellophane case that you'll all recall, defendants argued and the court found a broad market for all flexible wrapping materials. But the very next year, in DuPont GM, DuPont had a busy decade in the Supreme Court, DOJ argued for and the court found a narrow market of fabrics and finishes for automobiles only. Submarkets were not mentioned in either case.
John, they're asking you to use the mic.
Sorry about that. All that changed in the 1960s. Brown-Shue struggled to reconcile the two DuPont cases and said explicitly that there may be submarkets in a given case. That statement was pure dictum. The only markets found were men's, women's, and children's shoes, entirely separate markets. There were no submarkets, and although not cited in the guidelines, the other potential authority for submarkets came not from Brown-Shue, but from the Pabst case, which, as Keith elaborated, found 3 different relevant geographic markets. So with all this confusion, the court soon corrected course somewhat in Connecticut National Bank and the Marine Bank case, in each case rejecting overlapping markets. But those rejections were on the facts, not the law. Submarkets were, at least in theory, consistent with the dictum in Brown-Shue. But the submarket concept was essentially abandoned in the early 1980s by the Justice Department. And in the 1992 guidelines, Justice, through the good work of Greg Worden, more explicitly rejected submarkets by articulating the smallest market principle. Applying the smallest market principle, you don't have Wisconsin, the regional area, and the whole United States. If it's the smallest market, it's Wisconsin. So the smallest market principle, as articulated in the guidelines, is that the Justice Department generally will consider the relevant product market to be the smallest group of products, and that satisfies the hypothetical monopolist test. Now, by the end of the 1980s, there was a broad academic and judicial consensus against submarkets. Arita and Hovenkamp in particular explained that a market is a market when it satisfies the relevant test, be it hypothetical, monopolist, or otherwise. So the concept of submarket is essentially meaningless. And the courts agreed with that. In 1995, the district court in the Donray case, affirmed by the Eighth Circuit, was able to say The emerging consensus of antitrust scholars and case law seems to be that the term submarket is unnecessary. So, but fast forward to the 2023 guidelines, which loudly endorse overlapping markets, citing only brown shoe. So we'll see how that approach fares in court if the agencies actually pursue it rather than just threatening to do so. So what do we say? So Keith and I say that there's no more than one relevant antitrust market for any given transaction. Market definition, as Keith mentioned, is a function of the constraints the party or parties face on their competitive activities. If a constraint is significant, it's in the market. If not, it isn't. So if firms A and B are substantially constrained by C, but only insignificantly constrained by D, then C is in the market and D is not. It is useless and wrong to say that there's a larger market, including D, of which the ABC market is a submarket. The upshot is that for any given transaction, there is a single relevant antitrust market and no submarket. Our proposed rule, which we view as an articulation of prior guidelines and a reflection of prevailing case law, does not mean a single market in every case. If a market involves both widgets and gidgets, there may well be two separate markets. Likewise, in a case like FTC against Cisco, which was a food market, not a microphone market, there might be one market for national customers who need nationwide service and a separate market for local customers who do not. So, Keith, tell us about Amex and how that helps our case.
Sure. Thanks, John. Let's see. Is this on again? I think it's on. No? Yes. Okay. Great. Thank you. So we're left a little bit with a void, right, up to this point. We've got a dictum from Brown Shoe, but no holding. We've got Pabst, which had a holding, which was then kind of wiped clean by the banking cases. So what is the rule today? I think the cleanest articulation of the rule, or at least the best way to start, is from the Amex case. And that is, thankfully, a recent precedent with a holding. Amex holds that when assessing competition involving a multi-sided transaction platform, the relevant market encompasses all sides of that platform, and the plaintiff must prove a net anti-competitive harm in that market. Underlying the rule is the principle that each credit card transaction can be assigned to one and only one relevant market. One market per transaction. What's relevant to us and what's interesting is a little bit of the history of that litigation. So when that complaint was first brought, about a decade ago, the Justice Department alleged a submarket. They alleged that there was a market for credit card services provided to merchants, which was one part of the platform, and that there was a submarket for those same services provided just to merchants in the travel and entertainment industry. They litigated that all the way through trial, and the district court rejected the idea of a submarket and said there is only one market of those two that were pro-offered, and it's the broader market for all services provided to those merchants, regardless of what kind of merchant they are. When that decision was then appealed to the Second Circuit, Justice changed their tune. And rather than saying we have one market and then a separate submarket, they said we have separate markets, non-overlapping, totally distinct. We have one on the consumer side, we have one on the merchant side. Same transaction, but two markets, one for each set of customers. The Second Circuit rejected that approach, and so did the Supreme Court, right? They defined one market that encompasses the entire transaction, whether it's on the consumer side or on the merchant side. And they rejected attempts to define what was effectively a submarket just on the merchant side or just on the consumer side. So the upshot of all that is that we do have a recent precedent in this space, right? We have Amex's 2018 holding. And although it is formally limited to two-sided transaction markets, and we readily acknowledge that, we think that the same intuition applies much more broadly and explains much of the history that John had given you earlier about how courts have come to define submarkets very sparingly. So, just to formalize the rule, which I know you already heard from John, our proposed rule is that each transaction involving a particular product or service can be allocated to no more than one relevant antitrust market. Or, because I like to make things really simple, to me it's just the no double counting rule. Once you've counted a transaction once in one market, don't count it again in another market. So if we think about the beer market, if you've counted those transactions in the state of Wisconsin, don't count them again in a Midwestern market. Don't count them a third time in a national market. It's going to be the same with cookies. Once you've counted it in one market, don't count my purchase of Chips Ahoy in an all-food market. I always think it's helpful to illustrate this. So I have what our commentator calls the wedding cake illustration. And you know, you've got kind of these different versions, but let's walk through them. So on the far left, you've got kind of a very traditional plain vanilla antitrust market, option one, right? One market, there are kind of no variations. That's clearly going to be fine under our rule. The second option, option two, is kind of like the Cisco analog, if you were to illustrate it, right? There's going to be separate customer groups that are non-overlapping, and so there's going to be one customer group for the national customers, I guess we'll call that the blue circle, just for simplicity, and another market for the local customers. That's going to be kind of the yellow piece of the market. The permutations on the other side of the line are all permutations that we would submit break the OMT rule, and so that we would propose are rejected. And you can imagine one like a Venn diagram, which is option 5, where some transactions are only in one market and some transactions are in two. You can consider the wedding cake, you know, option 4, which is essentially what Pabst is, or the guidelines submission with food and chocolate chip cookies and all the rest. But those are the permutations, and that's the way that we frame it up. One caveat, which I think is important and is kind of a little bit buried in our article. We do think that if the conduct is unlawful under two different definitions of the relevant market, right? If the transaction is unlawful, whether you're alleging local markets in New York City, in Philadelphia, and Pittsburgh, or it's unlawful if it's a regional market, for example, the plaintiff should be able to allege both, right? You should not be penalized for alleging a local market and having the court conclude that it's a regional market and reject the complaint. If it's still unlawful, allege them both in the alternative, but the court needs to choose. The court needs to decide it is either the local market or it's the regional market, or it's, you know, whatever version the defendant has offered. So we allow for that flexibility. We just require the court to ultimately make a choice. To sum it up then, we think the guidelines endorsement of overlapping markets is misplaced, and the citation to the brown shoe dictum is unpersuasive. Courts have long followed something like the one market per transaction rule, at least since the 1980s, but have struggled to explain why they do it. Intuitively, they understand that it doesn't make sense to say that cookie purchase is both in a food market and in a cookie market at the same time, but it's not always, there's no clear rationale in some of the old cases. We think Amex substantially simplified the exercise and points the way for a more generalizable rule, the one market per transaction rule. And we think that courts should actually weigh the evidence and make a choice. That's it. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Ed Duffy. I'm a partner at Baker Botts, specializing in antitrust litigation. I was previously at the DOJ Antitrust Division, litigating one of the cases that was actually mentioned in Keith and John's article. Just want to start saying that I think this article is very helpful just from a practical perspective. I'm somebody that litigates cases and is trying to persuade and present to audiences that are not steeped in antitrust, whether those be generalist judges, occasionally juries. And I think one thing that Keith said that's particularly important is that, you know, antitrust is not smart enough to hold, you know, multiple conflicting ideas of what the market is at the same time. I think that's a very important insight, and one that applies with even more force if you're trying to present and persuade those that are not, you know, fully spending their time in this area. And the at the same time part, I think, leads to one observation I had with the paper, and that's that the notion of alleging multiple conflicting markets at the same time is particularly problematic. One of the things that the paper does that I think is a very important insight is it recognizes markets can change over time. You can have new innovations, you can have new entrants, you can have companies leaving the market, and building that flexibility in to allow markets to change is something that I think is particularly important. But you can conceive of middle cases where the underlying economic facts of the market may not have changed, but the markets may be alleged differently in one matter, in one way, and then it changes without any real change in the underlying economic circumstances, which I think is kind of an interesting concept of, what do the courts do in those circumstances? How should things be treated? You could conceive of different evidence presented, different transactions and conduct that are at issue. And so that's one just kind of question I have is what should the courts do in that particular circumstance? The other thing I'll say, so I litigated the JetBlue Spirit case, which you quote in the paper. We have the wedding cake graphic here, and you quoted Judge Young's opinion where he said the DOJ was trying to have its cake and eat it too, with respect to one kind of small aspect of the market definition in that case. So you started the paper and ended it with cake, which I think was quite fitting. But the underlying question in JetBlue Spirit when it came to market definition was whether the smaller city pair markets alleged by the government were the right way to look at the transaction, or whether a larger national market, which is what the parties were arguing, should be viewed as the right market. And an interesting aspect was JetBlue in litigation just a couple years earlier had endorsed kind of the more smaller city pair routes. And so how that was litigated kind of put this issue to the fore of inconsistent definitions being alleged. And Judge Young, very decisive judge, somebody who saw himself as somebody that really did need to make decisions as opposed to holding these multiple ideas in his head at once, came down one way. Very different approach was taken by the judge in the T-Mobile Sprint merger challenge, which had a similar notion of smaller geographic markets being alleged alongside a larger nationwide market. And there, no decision was made. Both markets were kind of considered at the same time, which I think leads to another important insight, which is that the rule that you are proposing is it's not really favoring one party or another. It is, I think, on its face, a quite neutral rule, so that even though you're using the updated merger guidelines as somewhat of a foil to put your theory against, I do think that there are circumstances quite clearly where the multiple market approach has kind of led to decisions that did not favor the enforcement agency. So it's just kind of an interesting concept to think of, and one that I think gives a lot of credence to the underlying validity economically and legally of the one market per transaction rule. Another interesting thing just to think of is there have been a lot of cases in the last year, kind of since your article was written, that make for an interesting thought experiment to see how would this come out differently in a particular case? Do the courts apply the rule consistently despite some of the rhetoric? One case that I found interesting in this approach was the FTC v. Tapestry decision, which on its face uses a lot of the same language from Brown Shoe, quotes Brown Shoe quite extensively, adopts a market definition that does bear a lot of resemblance to kind of the nested approach of a luxury accessible handbags potentially within other markets. But at the end of the day, the analysis actually followed by the court seems to be quite consistent despite the language. It's very consistent with the actual holding of Brown Shoe itself, where despite the language of submarkets and so forth, you ultimately are only putting the transaction in one particular market. But it does lead, I think, to another question that I have, is that there have been a lot of cases in the last few years that have not adopted, or not followed, I should say, the hypothetical monopolist test. It wasn't part of the evidence put in front of the court. Instead, there has been a trend, including in the Tapestry case, Google search being another, where the Brown Shoe factors were the evidence that was kind of put forward by the enforcement agencies. And one of the things that your paper notes is kind of furthering the applicability of this rule and its potential to be used, is that starting in the 80s, there was the adoption of the hypothetical monopolist test, a focus on cross-elasticities of demand, and the narrowest market principle. And so that's one question is, if courts do start accepting market definitions where a hypothetical monopolist test isn't presented and they're defining markets around the brown shoe factors, does it make it harder practically to pick a market if multiple markets are being alleged and you have somewhat squishier, often qualitative factors that are being used? So I think that that's one thing that's also important to look at. And the other thing I would say, just thinking of the search in ad tech opinions, like I'll note, Judge Mehta, despite adopting the government's proposed definition in search, did somewhat criticize the lack of a hypothetical monopolist test. And then in ad tech, one of the things that I found interesting was the geographic market definition of a U.S. versus a worldwide market. The judge did criticize Google for kind of proposing a broader market for a product, but a very narrow, relatively speaking, market geographically, which I think is getting at this important just point that to the extent inconsistent arguments are being made, a fact finder is going to be quite reluctant to endorse them. So I think even if there are some courts that don't apply the one market per transaction rule, just as a practical matter, having consistency in approach is something that is intuitively beneficial just from a litigation standpoint. So I am kind of curious your thoughts on if the hypothetical monopolist test isn't used, does that create any issues for your theory? And also the distinction between inconsistent markets in one particular matter versus across different matters close in time.
So let me give something of a crack to that. No, I don't think it makes a difference what test you're using to define the relevant market, be it the brown shoe factors of the hypothetical monopolist test or price parallelism as in the Stigler-Sherwin article. I think all of those can be used, but you still have to come up with one market to evaluate the transaction in at the end of the day. You can evaluate it in several, but if you're going to find it illegal, you better find one market where you're confident that it's illegal. Do you want to take the other one?
Yeah, the question of change over time, right? Yeah, so Ed, I think that is an interesting question. I think if the underlying facts have not changed, then the answer should not change. One illustration, it's not close in time, are the coal cases. And so I was at the commission when they were considering the Peabody case, or what ultimately became the Peabody case, which of course was, like the second or third iteration of the coal mergers. And there had been Arch Coal, about a decade before, that had said there's a separate market for Southern Powder River Basin coal that has 8,800 BTUs, right? And then, 10 years pass, we've got the shale boom, we've got a lot of changes in the electricity market, and when Peabody gets litigated, the FTC comes in with the old definition and says, well, of course, it's 8,800 BTU coal from Wyoming. Everybody knows that. And the parties said, well, no, the market has changed. We've got a lot of natural gas generation that's coming online. We've got a lot of coal that's leaving the market. We are constrained as coal producers by what the natural gas guys and nuclear and everybody else is doing these days. And what was interesting and I think problematic is the court said, you're both right. The court said, well, yes, you both are constrained by natural gas and nuclear, and so there's this all energy market where the transaction is not problematic. However, there's also an only coal market where you are not constrained by natural gas at the same time. That's a problem, and therefore I'm going to enjoin the transaction. So I think you do see it play out in litigation, not often quite so close in time, I think, as you're thinking, though, Ed.
So let me just say a couple more things. When we learned that there would be a discussant for our presentation, our immediate reaction was panic. But I do have to say that I thought you were very clear, very helpful, and I thank you.
Thank you.